Hi. First of all, Happy New Year. I'm a bit late to the party with that one, but, well, at least I said it now. And of course, I have to say this. We haven't spoken since last year. Can you imagine that? All right. Now that that's out of the way, let's continue our discussion from where we left off. So this video is part of a series of videos on becoming ourselves and how to become ourselves. And in the first video in the series, we discussed what it means to be ourselves and why it's important. And then we got a little bit into a series of principles on how to become ourselves, that guide us on how to become ourselves. So the first principle in the video was radical honesty, where we talked about what it means to not lie to ourselves and also how to figure out how to tell the truth to ourselves, because those are sort of two separate things. Then in the second video, we discussed the second principle. So there are four principles. The first one was radical honesty. The second one was orienting ourselves towards peace. And we talked about how that peace that we seek outside, right, to end wars like the Ukraine war and so on, are things that we need to cultivate in ourselves. First and foremost, we need to make peace with ourselves in order to make peace with others. And now in this third video, we are going to be discussing the next principle out of four. And this third principle, you're probably familiar with it if you're into Jordan Peterson, if you know his works. He has a rule in his book, 12 Rules for Life, which is titled something like, take care of yourself as if you're someone responsible for helping. And this is sort of the principle that I want to discuss today, taking care of ourselves as if we're someone responsible for taking care of. And well, Jordan Peterson was the inspiration for this, and he details it maybe better than I will. But I want to take things in a little bit of a different direction with regards to taking care of ourselves. And I want to do that to bring sort of a complementary approach to his more psychologically focused way of talking about this principle. So when we talk about taking care of ourselves as if we're someone responsible for taking care of, what comes to mind for me is actually something from the Bible, from the New Testament. There is a parable in there where Christ is asked by someone something like, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law of Moses?" And if I recall correctly, that's meant to be a trap for him, because there isn't supposed to be a sort of greatest commandment. And Christ very skillfully replies with something like this. He says something like this: the first, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your thought, and with all your might. And then he goes on to say, and this is what I want to talk about today with regards to taking care of ourselves. He says, and the second, most equally important, is love your neighbor as yourself. So we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves. Well, first of all, that's a little bit, well, it's a little bit difficult, because he doesn't say love the people that you like as you would love yourself. No, he says very sort of a across the board statement: love everyone, your neighbor, right? Your neighbor is everyone. That becomes very clear in the rest of the biblical text. So we're called to love everyone as ourselves. But that raises an important question, right? Because there's that part at the end, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so I have to love myself. Now, what does that mean exactly? Of course, probably the default answer that comes up in the minds of many of us is something like, to love myself is a kind of narcissistic thing. I myself, and I. That's love of self. But no, it's actually much more nuanced than that. I keep bringing to mind this book that I'm reading. I have the Romanian version, but there's the English version as well somewhere online. You can look it up on Amazon. It's this book. I probably mentioned it. I hope it's focusing. It's a book by Jean-Claude Larcher, The Therapeutics of Spiritual Illnesses. You can, if I recall correctly, there's an English version on Amazon with a name like that. So this book details a lot of the writings of the church fathers, and one of the things that they get into is this idea of love of self. And what's very interesting is that love of self actually has two aspects. There's a positive aspect and there's a negative aspect. The negative aspect is what we mentioned earlier, right? It's loving myself in a sort of narcissistic way, to put a lot of focus on myself and everything that I want and need in this world. Well, mostly what I want, not so much what I need. And we can discuss that in a different video, but that's the negative aspect. But the positive aspect, the holy love of self, let's say, is to love yourself as a creation of God. And that's what Christ means when he says to love our neighbor as ourselves. It means to love our neighbor as a creation of God, as we love ourselves as a creation of God. And of course, that doesn't necessarily come naturally to many of us. In some cases, because we're focused on ourselves in that narcissistic way. So it's not really a love of us as creations of God, more like love of self as a kind of self-aggrandizement, to inflate ourselves, to feel more like gods, even though that very quickly falls apart. But anyway, it's not in that sense that we can descend into that narcissistic love of self in that way, but we might also struggle with love of self in terms of being very critical with ourselves, and maybe having some vices, some addictions, maybe struggling with different emotions that we don't handle very well, like anger, or maybe intense sadness that we don't really know how to deal with, and we don't really love ourselves in that respect. So here's something that some people might disagree with. I had a discussion some time ago with a few friends about this idea that we are called to love our neighbor as ourselves, and my corollary, that what I understand from that, is that we treat others as we treat ourselves, consciously or otherwise. And of course, I caught a little bit of slack for that, because one question is, what do you mean? I don't always treat others as I treat myself. Maybe in some cases, if I'm very critical with myself, I'm not very critical with others. I don't criticize them the way I criticize myself. Or I don't know, if I'm very harsh, or I'm maybe too lenient with myself, that doesn't necessarily mean that I act the same way with others. But that's sort of a surface level understanding of what it means that we treat others as we treat ourselves. It's more, let's see if I can make sense of this in a way that I can explain. Let's say you struggle with being very critical of yourself, and you see someone who is doing the same thing. Now, you are struggling with that. You haven't dealt with self-criticism very well. So how can you help your neighbor with their self-criticism? Of course, it's maybe a little bit easier, right? Because you got a bit more distance from your neighbor, so you can look at their situation a little bit more even-minded, cool-minded. But that doesn't mean that you know how to help them, that you understand what the answer might be to their struggle. And in some cases, you don't need to understand. It's enough if you just stay with them and talk to them and listen to them and help them find a solution. But I would say, again, that attitude of being willing to listen to our friend, let's say, who is struggling, comes from an attitude that we need to adopt in ourselves and then bring out into the world. That's what I understand when Christ says to love our neighbor as ourselves. Being that we are creations of God, we need to understand how to love that creation of God that is ourself, and then to bring that love with us in our interactions with the world. And to the degree that we fail to love ourselves as creations of God, we fail to love our neighbor in similar regards as creations of God. Maybe we don't treat them exactly the same way that we do, but I think we can agree that if there are things that we are confronted with that we don't know how to deal with, if someone else is dealing with the same thing in the same manner, we probably don't know how to help them either. Nietzsche has this idea that um, he had this parable that I heard some time ago about how he was criticized that, well, you you don't know how to help yourself, so how can you help others? And his response was something along the lines of, if I found the key to my neighbor's chain and it doesn't unlock my chain, does that mean that I shouldn't unlock my neighbor's chain? And that's a very good point. But at the same time, at least from my perspective, that key that opens my neighbor's chain, there isn't multiple keys. There's not his key and my key. There's one key as far as I'm concerned. Now, it doesn't mean that we have a sort of one size fits all approach to life. Like you should live the way I live or I should live the way you live. That's not what I'm talking about, but it's more that the key, the answer to our suffering, to our struggles, to all of that is actually one answer, and it's, in my opinion, the pursuit of truth with love, with wisdom, cultivating those things, with cultivating love, cultivating wisdom, learning to speak the truth, learning to steer clear of the path that takes us away from truth and into deceit, right? And that's sort of the one key that opens my chain and your chain as well. And it's deeply tied, in my opinion, with this idea of taking care of ourselves, because we are creations of God. Like I said in the first video in the series, we are made in the image and likeness of God, and that image of God in ourselves is actually ourself. It's everything that we can and need to be. And that's as we manifest more of what we need to be in this life, we become closer to God, we become more like God. And that in Christianity, at least, there's a sort of equivalence. We draw an equal between God and truth. We say that truth is God and God is truth, right? The logos, Christ, is understood as truth. And he even says, he describes himself in terms of, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And that's a very strange statement for me. I don't understand it very well yet. But it does hint to this idea that I tried to outline earlier, that we are on a path towards truth, and the way towards truth. And that's sort of our life, insofar as we're oriented towards that. So that's one thing that I want to say about taking care of ourselves. So we should take care of ourselves as creations of God, and in taking care of ourselves, we become better able to take care of those that we love and the people around us. And that's one thing. Now, one other thing that's struck me regarding this idea of taking care of ourselves, it's another passage from the Bible. This one's from the Old Testament. Immediately after Genesis, there's a story about the first people, the first real people. Peterson has this notion that Cain and Abel are the first real people, and they're brothers. They're born from Adam and Eve, and he says that what makes them real people is the fact that they are born. They're not made out of the earth like Adam and Eve were by God. They are born out of Eve. through Adam and Eve's procreation. So anyway, there's the story of Cain and Abel. You probably know it. Just to recap it, it's a short story. It goes like this. There are these two brothers, right? And one is a shepherd and one tills the earth, works the earth. And they serve God, and they each make sacrifices to God. Abel brings the best sheep from his flock and sacrifices it and burns it, and the smoke rises up to the sky to God, and it's pleasing to him. And meanwhile, Cain brings what he harvests from the earth, and he also burns them, and the smoke rises up, and it's kind of a funny scene in a way, in that if you go to Orthodox churches, and probably other churches have this as well, and you see the depiction of the Cain and Abel story, very often the smoke that rises up from Abel's altar goes all the way up to God, and it's very nice. But the smoke that comes out from Cain's sacrifice blows back into his face, and of course, nobody likes having smoke blowing into his face. It makes you tear up. It's very unpleasant. So there's this idea that for some reason their sacrifices aren't accepted equally. There's a hint in the story that Cain is doing something wrong, and God tells him that. And Cain sort of tries to take God to task for this. Like, what do you mean you're not taking my sacrifice? I did everything you asked of me. And God tells him, well, you should look a little bit to yourself before you go ahead and criticize the divine, let's say. And there's two answers that we can have to that sort of situation in life, because that's each of us at some point or another, right? We do our best to accomplish a goal, an important goal, we make sacrifices towards that end, and it falls flat on its face. We fall flat on our faces. And we have two options in that situation. One option, which is what Cain ended up doing, is to become bitter and to say something like, well, what do you mean? This life is so unfair. Let's curse this life. I hate it, and I hate my brother because he's more successful than me. Look at this guy. Why is he getting everything and I'm still stuck in the mud? That's one answer. The other answer might be, okay, I tried to do something and it hasn't really gone my way. Well, okay, what am I doing wrong? What can I do better? Like, that's another approach that we can have when we encounter a sort of rejection from reality, right? We make sacrifices, we're rejected. Okay, we can take a step back and wonder, how did I end up here? What did I do wrong? What can I do wiser? And of course, Cain doesn't opt for this option. He goes for option A, and he raises his fist at God and goes to Abel, and he kills his brother. And then, this is the part that I wanted to get to from the story. God comes to Cain, and he asks him. Of course, it's a kind of rhetorical question. He already knows what happened, but he wants Cain to fess up. And he asks Cain, "Where's your brother?" And the question that Cain asks is, in my opinion, a very important question to clarify. He asks God, well, what am I, my brother's keeper? And that's precisely the issue. Cain and Abel are not just figures in a story from a book that you read and then you put aside and you go and live your life as if nothing happened. Cain and Abel are in each of us. They are aspects of ourselves, positive and negative aspects of ourselves. And we can say in a way that they are in a competition to take control of our motivation, our thoughts, and our emotions moment to moment. Right? They have these sort of motivations of their own, and they, insofar as we fail to realize them, to become conscious of these things, they possess us and we act in ways that we don't necessarily know. Sometimes it's in useful and wise ways, other times it's less useful, more destructive ways. And so Cain and Abel are part of each of us. And the answer, the proper answer to Cain's question, what am I, my brother's keeper, is yes. I am, in fact, my brother's keeper. My brother is myself, that I am responsible for taking care of. And then my brother is also the person next to me, it's the person I'm talking to, it's the person that I'm engaged in some sort of activity with, that I meet on the street, that so on and so forth. My brother, my sister is everyone. But they are also in myself. I am with them and they are with me. And we need to learn how to make peace between those two brothers in ourselves. Okay, this is sort of the I hesitate to say theoretical foundation for the principle. It's not really a theory, what I'm trying to outline here. I'm trying to outline a way of looking at ourselves, at the world, at this issue of taking care of ourselves in a way that helps us move closer to God, to becoming wiser. So let's look at a few concrete things that we each can do. One thing that I would recommend trying out if you're looking to take better care of yourself. This is sort of a very practical thing. Go on a date with yourself. It sounds kind of silly in a way. What do you mean, go on a date with myself? What, am I supposed to dress up and go to town somewhere? And my answer would be something like, yeah. Find an activity that you enjoy doing, and then go and do it by yourself. Learn to enjoy being by yourself, doing things that that you find meaningful and are pleasant to you. And here's an example from my own life. Back when I was an undergraduate at the psychology at the Faculty of Psychology, what I would do after having my final exams in the first year was, after each exam, I went to the town center, to the town square, and I would sit down at a restaurant. It was summer and it was quite pleasant outside. It was sunny, and I enjoyed looking at the square and seeing people walking around, looking at the sky, the clear sky, and it was just such a pleasant sight to behold for me. And I would take a book with me and sit there, order something to eat, order something to drink, and spend an hour and a half reading, eating, watching people, and just enjoying the moment. So you can do something similar in that regard. Of course, if it's something that you find that resonates with you. The idea is to take care of ourselves. And one idea is to go on a date with yourself. Do something for yourself, not in a selfish way, right? It's not about, giving me rewards or anything like that. It's more of a signal that here I am by myself, taking care of myself. That's one thing you can try. Another thing, especially if you're feeling kind of tense, you might have some tension, let's say, in your muscles over here, in your the name escapes me, but it's these muscles here, or maybe in your shoulders, your arms, wherever. One thing you can do, and this is an advice that I got from a friend a while ago, take a hot bath. If you have, a bathroom that lets you take a bath, or a hot shower if not, and give yourself a massage. Now, I don't mean that kind of massage, let's get it clear. I mean a massage for relaxation, right? You put yourself in the warm water, in the hot water, and you start massaging the different tense areas of your body, like this area right here, or the back of your head, maybe your temples, your jaws, your arms, so on and so forth. And you take it slow, you take your time to do this. And again, the idea is to signal to yourself that I am here with myself, taking care of myself. Because very often we get so enmeshed in our day-to-day lives that we forget to do things for ourselves, to take care of ourselves. And that eventually ends up trickling into our relationships with others. We sort of become neglectful of them to the degree that we are neglectful of ourselves, or we don't know when would be a good time to take care of the people around us because we don't really know when to take care of ourselves either. So a warm bath for relaxing can help a lot. And one other thing, I, I, I think I have mentioned this in my other videos as well. I'm sort of fascinated nowadays by the idea of breathing and breathing correctly, because one thing that happens when we're stressed out is we forget to breathe properly. Our breathing becomes sort of superficial. We take shallow breaths, like maybe slower, maybe quicker, something like that, but it's not a deep breath. And we often breathe in through our chests, right? We bring air into the upper part of our lungs. But actually, one way of helping us stay more relaxed, more aware of what's going on in intense situations is to learn to do diaphragmatic breathing. It's not belly breathing per se, but it's bringing our breath somewhere down around here where our diaphragm is. So when you breathe in, you're sort of, in lack of a better explanation, sort of your belly that rises up first and then your chest. And then you breathe out slowly. Now, oftentimes psychologists will recommend you do this as a kind of meditation. Do this for 5 minutes a day when you're feeling tense, and it'll help you relax. What I would say is actually you can take this one step further, and you can learn to do this almost all the time. And I say this thinking also of the way samurai warriors discuss this breathing. They have a very big emphasis. They make an emphasis often on how to breathe correctly in day-to-day life, and especially in combat. They recommend breathing a certain way, and I would say in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, life itself is combat, and in that sense, we should always be attentive and aware and not too tense, so that we can react appropriately to the various challenges that pop out throughout the day. Many of them we don't even expect. So breathing correctly can help a lot. One technique that I like, and I've probably mentioned this, but I'll mention it again, even if it's a repeat. It's the physiological sigh. You can do it pretty much anytime, anywhere, on the go. And it presupposes, so let's say that if you count to 5 and take air and you breathe in, when you reach 5, your lungs fill up, right? So by the time you reach that number 5, your lungs are full. And the physiological sigh is something like breathe till 4, till you count to 4, so you're about 80% full, and then take just a tiny split moment and then breathe in the rest of the breath. So something like, and you breathe out slower than you breathe in. Now, I may have exaggerated the movements a little bit. The point isn't to tense up as you breathe in like I did, right? It's just to breathe and do this in 2 steps. Breathe in 80% and then another 20%. Wait just a tiny bit at the top and then bring it all out. And you can do this pretty much all the time. I don't mean this in a kind of maladaptive coping mechanism kind of way. So I don't mean do this so that you avoid feeling anxious or anything like that. I mean do this so that you are aware and present and sufficiently relaxed to approach any issue that arises throughout the day. And that's another method, I would say, for taking care of ourselves. And this will allow us also to help others when they approach us with various issues that are stressful to them and to us. So let's do a quick recap, because that's roughly all that I wanted to talk about with regards to this principle. So we talked about this idea of taking care of ourselves as if we're someone responsible for taking care of. It stems from Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and I wanted to have a more to complement his approach with more of a spiritual, religious take on things. And we discussed Christ's commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves, and we got into why it's important to love ourselves in order to take care of others. And we also talked about how this idea of love of self can have two different meanings. There's, of course, the narcissistic love of self, which is not what we're talking about when we say to love our neighbor as ourselves, but rather this other way of self-love, which is love of self as a creation of God, which we can then we can then help others manifest as well. So to learn to help others love themselves as creations of God, and to love each other as creations of God. And we got into that. Then we talked about the Cain and Abel story, and we saw that the conflict between those two brothers who make sacrifices to God, one is accepted and one isn't, those brothers are also parts of ourselves that we need to learn to reconcile. And finally, we got into more practical things, like what can I do concretely to better take care of myself. Now, I focused a little bit more on relaxation. So things like taking yourself out on a date, to do things that are meaningful and pleasant to you, and to learn to be content and at peace being by yourself, so that you can then, of course, go on dates with other people and learn to be content with them and the different situations that arise. We also talked about another technique for relaxation, and this involves taking a hot bath or a hot shower and to massage the different tense parts of our bodies. Like, especially for many people, it's going to be this part related to the back of the head, this muscle right here, the traps, that's the muscle, yeah. So the traps, you want to massage the traps often, and to just signal to yourself this idea that I am here with myself, taking care of myself. And finally, we discussed a little bit about breathing and learning to do diaphragmatic breathing. So doing it, not taking air in, first of all, not so much into my chest, but first into my diaphragm. So just below or around the bottom of our ribs. We take air in from there, and then we take air into the chest, and then we breathe out slowly. And we can combine this with the physiological sigh, which is breathing in 80% of the way, so that our lungs are 80% full, and then breathing in the rest of the 20% and waiting a bit before breathing out slowly. So and of course, the focus isn't on tensing up as we struggle to bring all the air in, but rather on relaxing and focusing on that. So that was what I wanted to say about this principle of taking care of ourselves. And now in the next video and the final video in the series, we are going to be discussing the last principle, which is going to be that we have in ourselves all that we need in order to heal, to be whole, to become wiser. And I want to get into that discussion because I find it very interesting. You've probably noticed by now that the focus is a lot on the inner world that we each have, and on how to clean it up, tidy it up, and to take care of it so that it reflects back into the world that we live in, into the outer world. So that's going to be a similar, we're going to have the similar approach in the last video, and I hope it's going to be an interesting discussion for you as well. I really enjoy talking about these things. It's for me, the inner and the outer world are deeply connected, and insofar as we learn to have a good relationship with ourselves, we learn to have good relationships with others. So yeah, that's good enough for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye bye.